York is probably much like working in other cities around the globe. We all work very hard these days, but I gotta say, in New York City, we operate at just a different speed. Personally, as a mergers and acquisitions reporter for the New York Times, I don't work long days. I work long days, nights, and weekends. And I suspect the same is true as both my panelists. Golbie and Jana work at two of the kind of highest intensity companies in the city, both known for having extremely rigorous work cultures, and yet both of them have managed to solve that paradox in a way. Both have managed to kind of not lose their edge while still retaining a modicum of mindfulness, at least, on our best days, I think. We'll hear their tricks of the trade in just a moment, but first I want to just give a sense of what it's like to work at BlackRock, at Twitter, and perhaps at the Times. And so Golbie, it's the largest asset manager in the world. You manage trillions of dollars. There are thousands of people in headquarters right in Midtown. I gotta believe this place is like a hive of bees always humming. How do you survive?
It's definitely a fast-paced, high-intensity place. I survive personally the way most people survive, day by day, experiencing my life as it unfolds. There are times when it's definitely more intense and it feels like you're in a reactionary state. And there are times when you're able to more gracefully navigate the stresses, but it's definitely high pace and high intensity.
Jana, you've worked at startups, you've worked at other big brands. How does Twitter compare?
I describe Twitter as being the most intense environment that I've ever been a part of. And I feel like I've been a part of really intense environments throughout my career. But it is, I walk in the door, and the minute I walk in, it doesn't stop until I leave. And then, as you described, you go home and you continue to work on the weekends, at night. And it tends to be almost like a roller coaster at times.
Yeah. Now, Golbie, you were at BlackRock, I believe, before you really deepened your meditation and yoga practice many years ago. What's been the change? Have you experienced a noticeable kind of change in the way you've been able to manage this intensity?
Yes, definitely. So I've been at BlackRock for more than 7 years, and my meditation practice really deepened and began in December of 2011. And it's been an evolution over that time, over the last 3 years, as I've learned to integrate my practice into my everyday life. Personally, for me, I used to experience a lot of stress. I wasn't very good at dealing with it. I probably handled it like everyone else. A lot of it was internal, not necessarily everyone could see it. But as my practice has evolved, I've integrated ways to pause throughout the day, to have perspective. It's really shifted the way I relate to my life completely. It's shifted everything. So I don't actually feel the levels of stress that I used to feel. I don't experience the levels of intensity. I might be moving at just as fast of a pace and actually am more productive, but it's with a lot less collateral damage to me and maybe, to everyone around me.
Yeah, I want to come back to that notion of productivity, but that purposeful pause, I think, is so essential over the course of what can be 20-hour workdays in this town. Jana, is that a technique you've used, or how do you actually find moments to stop and perhaps get off that train that never seems to slow down for us?
Yeah, I think for me, it's a lot about breathing, and it's taking time to step away when I know that I've got a sense throughout my body that intensity is just getting to a level where I need to step aside and slow down. And even if it's just for 10 seconds, it makes a big difference.
Are there techniques that you've used, Golbie? I know personally, I found essentially a mindful walking routine in my office. There's a long hallway that I need to traverse to get from my desk to the elevators, and there's a back way that kind of takes me through the hallway away from other people. And I try to make that actually a moment where I'm actually practicing mindful walking, as if I were almost on retreat. I don't walk quite as slowly, but of course, you don't have to be slow when you're mindful. Are there other particular techniques that perhaps have helped in the course of the day for you?
Well, in the course of the day, definitely. I do that exercise on the way to the subway, so I try and stay mindful walking on the way to the subway, which is part of my morning practice. While I'm at work, I actually do a lot of paying attention to the sensations I'm feeling in my body. So I go, like many of you probably, have meetings back to back to back, and sometimes have to switch topics so quickly it can make your head spin. And so often I'll just steal a quiet moment. I'll tend to go to our kitchen and I'll just center myself. And I'll start to do a quick body scan. I'll do some breathing. I might take a cup of tea and I just hold it and feel the warmth in my hands. But just the very few things to ground me into what's happening right now. And I use my body as an entry into the present moment.
Jana, similar experience at Twitter?
Yeah, I would say it's very similar. And I think that staying grounded and staying really present in the moment has been critical for me, so that I am able to switch from meeting to meeting, or my day there to when I go home, and shift to my family.
Finding these moments of practice in the middle of the day, of course, doesn't mean that the challenges go away. I mean, our bosses can still bug us, coworkers can still let us down from time to time, challenge us, deadlines can still loom. Are there particular examples where you've been faced with a real, pressing challenge at work, as always happens, and you've noticed the practice impact the way you responded? Jana.
So I had an experience, I guess probably about 6 months ago, and I had just changed into a new role, and I had actually raised my hand to move into this new role. And within a few weeks of being in that role, I was actually approached by a different group to join their group. And I had to listen to the opportunity. It was an opportunity I had to explore for myself. But I also felt like I owed it to my manager and to my manager's manager to be honest about the conversations. But I started those conversations by first saying, I'm really nervous to talk to you about this, and actually sharing how I felt in that moment, as well as to ask in those difficult conversations for my boss and his boss's perspective, and where they were coming at this, and so that I could understand. And ultimately, I think that it allowed me to really stay very focused and still feel like I had the opportunity to explore what I needed to for myself, and then make a decision.
Wonderful. Golbie, I suspect BlackRock is not without its tensions. It's known as an incredibly rigorous work culture. How have you used practice to navigate some of the inevitable, kind of tough situations that might come up on the job?
It's a good question, and there's a story that is related to it, if I may.
Please.
It's something that I shared with the community at BlackRock that practices meditation, and it happened to me one evening. I was on a subway on the way home, and I lived in Brooklyn at the time, so it was a longer subway ride. And I was telling Jana the story earlier. I was in an empty subway car, and there was someone who I assumed was homeless and was screaming and yelling and was having a bit of a fit. And I was sitting there reading my book, being aware of where he was and where he was located, but really trying to stay focused and just read my book. There was no imminent threat, so I didn't want to react to that. And he started to walk closer to me. And he paused just a couple feet away from me next to the doors. And the subway car stopped at the station, and the doors opened. And I saw him moving, and he was moving to leave. But before he left, he came and he stomped on my foot, and he walked out the door. And I remember I was looking down at my book, and I went, oh, that happened. I feel tingling in my toes. And then I kept reading. And then about 5 or 6 seconds later, I was like, oh my God, look what I just did. Like, I didn't freak out. I didn't react. My body didn't go into this shock state. I didn't think that there was some danger or my life was unsafe. I didn't attribute any meaning. And so I realized that that's actually really similar to what happens at work sometimes. You might not get physically attacked, but sometimes people say things that trigger you, or they do things that trigger you and they grab you. And I've been in those situations where I've been in a meeting and it's gotten heated. And I do the same thing that I did in that subway car, which showed me that I have the capacity to do it, which is just tap in. What am I feeling in this moment? Not give in to the pull or the grab, and to really recenter myself and, okay, what's real right now? And be mindful of what's happening, what's the actual event, and what is my interpretation of the event.
Yeah. As the saying goes, we all have to experience pain. We don't all have to suffer. I think that's, at the best of times, true at work as well. You mentioned this community, and so that begs the question, what's been the effect? I mean, as you both have become more mindful, have begun to practice, find ways to incorporate this mindfulness and meditation into your work lives. Have your colleagues noticed? Have your bosses noticed? Has it changed the way people respond, and perhaps they've even gotten interested? Jana, at Twitter?
Yeah, I think that while we don't have an official, I would say, meditation practice, especially within the New York office, I have found people who are like-minded. And even if we're not working together on a daily basis in our roles, we do come together. And that builds a very strong community around us, which I think does spread. And it almost infiltrates the rest of the organization without it being so obvious. But I do hear feedback from the team that I manage that I understand their perspective, and they can tell, they've seen the authenticity, that I do truly care about their individual perspectives, which is great. I mean, that feels amazing.
Golbie, slightly different story at BlackRock. People started asking questions, and a few years later, you've got a real community of meditators at BlackRock.
That's right, yeah. So I think people have noticed that this is a practice of mine, and something that I feel very passionately about. So last year, a year and a half ago, and I don't need to go into it now, you guys are going to hear from me tomorrow, but I started a program at BlackRock where I wanted to share my practice with members of the New York City community. And I pledged to show up every week and be really transparent about what I was learning and what my experience was, in case it was able to help anybody else. And it actually took off, like the woman who shared earlier today. And now there are 1,300 people at BlackRock who are part of this community. And twice a week I sit and lead a session. And there are other aspects to the program. I can explain it tomorrow if it's helpful. But now I'm very well known within the organization for my personal practice and what I do. And I have to make sure that everyone remembers it's not actually my full-time job. It's more my contribution. I have other responsibilities.
Yeah, wonderful. And I think, if I may, that's an opportunity to just remind the audience that this is happening across the country. At Intel, at Salesforce, at Aetna, at Green Mountain Coffee. There are communities of people who are committing to work in a different way and coming together and changing the culture of these big, Fortune 500 companies. And it's very extraordinary. It's something that I've been trying to track for the last few years. And I was so excited to find it's happening right under my nose at BlackRock and at Merrill Lynch as well, at Goldman Sachs. Some of the most unlikely places, but of course some of the places that perhaps need it most. You talked about that purposeful pause and about responding differently. What are some of the other benefits, if you will? And it's funny to use that word, but let's go ahead. Productivity, you mentioned, creativity perhaps. How have you noticed, your work self post beginning to deepen your practice has changed?
So I was telling David earlier, so the practice has completely changed my life in all those ways. I've noticed it from myself, I've noticed it from my colleagues, around productivity, around creativity, around community and transparency and authenticity. There really is this beautiful sense of people showing up with humanity and compassion within the community, and that's spreading into how they work with other people at the firm. For myself, productivity-wise, I have a lot on my plate, and I'm able to handle it, not always so gracefully, as you can ask my brother, who is sitting in the audience, but more gracefully than not, mostly because I have practiced, and I continue to practice, to let things go when they're done. So I try and always focus on what's in front of me and remind myself. In fact, I write down I have a morning ritual, and every morning I write down, today is the most important day of my life. Because it is, and it grounds me. It's the only day of my life. And throughout the day, I keep reminding myself this is the most important moment. And it keeps bringing me back. So even though my mind might want to be rehashing a work conversation that I had or a meeting that I thought went well or didn't go well, I try and let it go and come back to what's right here. And I find that I'm able to make those transitions through so many different things faster and handle more stress because I don't quite take it personally. I just turn it into, okay, what's the feeling sensation? Okay, now next.
Yeah. Jana.
Well, I think that it's made me less reactionary, so that I can take a step back and I can think, more proactively, which I think ultimately makes a huge impact on the results that I'm able to drive.
Yeah. For me personally, I don't have the luxury of being less reactionary as a reporter. And I just this week looked at my bylines at the New York Times, and I've only been there a year and a month. And in that time, I've written 300 stories. And it reminded me that every day I come into work and I have to face something, I have to write about it, and then the minute I file it to the editor, I essentially have to let it go and start again and begin again. And I have to, at best, do that with a really clean palette and a clear slate. And practice inevitably has aided me in that process over the years. Now, how do we?
One other
please.
thing I just wanted to add is that I think the other thing that I've noticed such a difference for myself was that I create less stories in my head. I used to tend to create all of these stories that were never true, and so as a result, I was expending so much wasted energy. And now I feel like my energy is just so much more focused in places where it should be.
That's a great point, and I mean, that's true, of course, not only in the workplace, but throughout our lives.
Yeah.
The amount of stories we can tell ourselves about other people and what they think of us in particular, that can take up lifetimes, no question. I got to say, though, we're in a safe space here, but not everyone kind of looks to meditation with the same fondness as perhaps this crowd. So as my friend Dan Harris, who I think is here later, says, meditation still, to some degree, has a PR problem. And so how do we overcome that? The three of us are, in a way, kind of in a position to perhaps, help solve that problem. But how have you, stayed, kind of retained your image, retained your credibility, if you will, as very serious professionals, while publicly acknowledging this other dimension to your lives? Golbie.
That's a good question. I view a lot of the opportunity that I have now as really a role of translation. So sharing my practice and doing it authentically and relating to the humanity in another person allows me to really reveal the impact that it's had on me. But what I've also done is really try and translate and articulate how to apply a practice to a work culture or a high-paced, high-performing life in a language that's non-threatening. Sometimes we bring in external teachers, and if they're not in that industry, if they're not in business, they sometimes say the wrong things and deliver the wrong message, and then all of a sudden the PR problem comes back up. So really, for me, it's been a matter of patiently articulating and explaining and pointing to research and showing people really what is possible with the practice, what it could be, and really being candid and being proud of it, actually.
Mm-hmm. What are some of those red flags? You talked about, there are moments when maybe the hair on people's neck will stand up and say, what have I gotten myself into?
The words? Okay, so talking about emotion, that word can be a trigger if used in the wrong context. Talking about energy, that word can be a trigger if used in the wrong context. So definitely saying Om, My boss used to think that all I did was go Om for half an hour with everyone. And I said, I've never once said that in this work context. And he goes, really? I thought that's all it was. And I said, oh, well, let me share.
I think even the word spirituality, to say that I'm a spiritual person, it's been this taboo topic or word in the business kind of environment, and finding other ways to express that.
Exactly. It's about skillfully articulating what it is that we're experiencing, which is really a human experience. On one spectrum, and this is how I explain it to people at work who often, are curious, cautiously curious, and I say, look, you can relate to it as though it's a mental exercise, that it's a shift in perspective, that you're changing the way you relate to your mind, a body sensation, sounds, how you perceive light, how you see things. And on another spectrum, or on the other end of the spectrum, it can be the portal to a very deep spiritual practice. It's not for one person or one organization to say what's right or wrong. It's really about what resonates with you. And so having a sense of who you're speaking with, what their drivers are, what are the things that might intimidate or make them fearful, and then using the language that resonates.
And Adam just earlier mentioned the word intention, and I thought that that was so apt to the way I sometimes think about bringing my practice into the workplace, which is sometimes before I'll have a meeting or make a call or even pick up the phone when it's ringing, just that moment to pause and ask myself, what's my intention in this interaction, can be incredibly valuable and can really kind of instantly drop me into a much more mindful and sensitive place without having to kind of have a negotiation with someone else about how we're going to have this interaction. It can happen very spontaneously.
I think it's also finding common ground, right? If you can find that commonality between you and the person that you're speaking with or that you're working with, and find that connection, and then you can almost bring it into the relationship without it being so obvious.
Wonderful. We have time for just one or two questions for our panelists. Yeah, please in the front, and I believe there are mics coming around.
Hi, my name is Katrina. I come from Norway, and I wonder what kind of words do you use instead of the spirituality, the Om, so like do you use trust, intention, humanity? How is that conceived as triggers? Or?
It's a fair question. Okay, so for example, when I will start a session, I want individuals to tap into whatever their intention was for showing up. I think it's important. I might not say intention, sometimes I do, but I say, what was your motivation for coming today? What was your inspiration for coming today? For some people in the audience, this is, those kinds of words aren't a trigger, it's no big deal. For others that are dipping their toe into it, or they came because a colleague said it, or I convinced them to come and try it out, I don't want to create an environment that feels a little too different, and different can be interpreted as unsafe. So I might say motivation or what's your inspiration? Instead of saying letting go, let go, relax, I say, well, experiment with releasing the tension in your body right now. So it almost is a little bit more clinical in some ways, but it resonates with a highly rational, highly intellectual, analytical population.
And you mentioned the research, and of course,
Absolutely.
There's reams of research these days that really show the effects on our brains and our bodies.
Definitely.
Maybe one more question? Well, I've got one. We've talked about productivity, we've talked about creativity, but of course, the history of some of these practices wasn't about making more efficient workers in Manhattan. It was about reducing suffering and cultivating kindness and empathy and compassion. And I have to ask, even if that's not the most obvious way it expresses itself in Midtown Tower of BlackRock or the open floor plan hive that is Twitter, have you noticed that? I mean, has it softened the edges? Has it actually made you perhaps a nicer person to work with? Not that either of you weren't totally pleasant to work with before.
I'd like to think so, for sure. I mean, I think that I have, I'm still passionate, I'm still driven. It's not that has gone away by any stretch of the imagination, because I think I entered the business world after graduating from college, and I had this kind of struggle between being really driven in business, but knowing that I had these other priorities that were important to me, but I've been able to merge the two together and feel like that was, perfectly acceptable and only made me a better, colleague and a better employee, but also just a better overall human being.
I had a similar experience. It's changed, hopefully, how I show up and how people experience me. I have really the pleasure of seeing it impact other people as well, though. And there is a really supportive and beautiful culture. And it's something that BlackRock really strives to cultivate. And this program, this community, is just one of the ways that enhances it. And so you see people sharing really personal things and really letting their humanity come to work, which is something that I believe organizations need to create more conditions for which that's okay. And so I will often share a story with the community during a session, and then there's time for them to share with each other. And the friendships that are formed are beyond what you normally form with a colleague. It's your real life showing up and creating the space for people to actually bring their real lives to work. Knowing that it won't be always, sitting in a meditation room or sitting in a boardroom, which is where we are, that there is work to be done, but that there is an opportunity for you to really be who you are.
Well, I applaud you on your efforts. You're making working in New York City a bit more mindful. And thank you to both our panelists.